Okay, welcome everyone to the Women Who Code Advocacy Town Hall. I'm looking for the presentation. It's not showing on my screen, but I just want to make sure it's visible before we get started. We will get started in just a moment. We've got a lovely little helpful slide deck to get us some introductory sort of comments together. And so we'll be sharing that. Let me see if I can add that to the stage. Here we go. I think that works. So welcome again, everyone, to the Women Who Code Advocacy Town Hall. We're really excited to have you here with us today. Just by way of reminder, all of the Women Who Code events and spaces follow the Women Who Code Code of Conduct to make sure that everyone feels safe and all ideas are respected. So you can read our full code of conduct on our website. And if you have any questions or want to do any reporting for any violations that you see, please let us know. Our advocacy town halls are periodic events that we put on with diversity, equity, and inclusion experts to give our audience a chance and our members a chance to kind of pick the brains of experts in this field, and so we can learn how to better advocate for ourselves and how to better advocate for other people, and just to generally be allies for underserved populations and also ourselves in tech. So we're really excited to have you here today to specifically talk about accessibility. Today we are talking about accessibility, and this is for anyone with disabilities who wants to be more empowered to advocate for themselves and also know their own rights, and also those who lead or work with or design in tech, right? Because we want to make sure that we're being good allies for everyone else as well. It's especially important because disabilities can be both seen and unseen, or visible and invisible. And it's important to know that just because someone maybe doesn't look like they have a disability or a disabled doesn't mean they aren't. They don't need accommodations, and they don't need allyship, and they don't need advocacy. So it's important for us to have these discussions holistically to make sure that everyone in the tech community does have an ally and is being advocated for. All right, moving along here. So again, for our radical inclusion in tech, so what you can expect to learn today is challenges and opportunities that individuals with disabilities face through the hiring process, workplace support and career growth. For workplace support and career growth, we want to go into a little bit of the legal rights and responsibilities and hiring practices and actionable ways to advocate for yourself and others. We'll talk about how allies can be advocates for individuals with disabilities, including in the workplace, and also how technologists can develop with accessibility in mind. So we have a couple icebreakers here. We would love to hear from you in the chat. Please share how the topic of accessibility has impacted you and why you're interested in knowing more about accessibility in tech. We're also curious, just on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you as an advocate for yourself or others, or as an ally for accessibility in tech? So we would love to hear more from you, just why this topic impacts you. We have several hundred people joining us today, so it would be interesting to see some of the responses. And I'm not sure if my backstage wizard is able to populate because I can't see the chat. Let's see here. We have here. Okay, great. 4. That's great. So we can always learn more. We have 4 from Michelle. We have Ellen from joining us from California. We have lots of people joining us from Chicago. Probably everyone has different levels and reasons why they might be joining us today. If someone's saying that they're an accessibility developer looking to learn ways they can improve. Someone with late diagnosed adult ADHD wants more information. We have 3s, 4s. So looks like we have a lot of different reasons why we're all here today. And luckily we have a great panel of experts who can speak to these issues on a lot of different ways. 3s, 4s. We're a really knowledgeable group here. Well, luckily we can, hopefully we'll be able to fill in some of the gaps here for you today as well. So I'm really excited to introduce to you our panel of experts here. So we have 3 panelists, And let me advance it here for you. Thank you. So looking forward to meeting our speakers today. We have Jessica Rafuse is a leader in accessibility and disability inclusion. As the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Policy for Accessibility at Microsoft, Jessica works with customers, partners, and policymakers to accelerate accessibility globally. Jessica is an attorney who, prior to joining the Microsoft team, promoted the principles of equal opportunity and affirmative action within multinational corporations. Jessica began her legal career in government, including her work as an administrative judge for the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Jessica earned a degree in Spanish and art history from the University of Washington and a Juris Doctorate from Seattle University School of Law. Jessica has muscular dystrophy and uses a power wheelchair. Thanks so much for joining us, Jessica, and I believe that we'll be adding everyone to the panel here shortly. Amy Carney is a certified professional in web accessibility that operates in Digilu, an independent web accessibility consultation and web design LLC. While getting certified, she documented her journey on 100 Days of Ally to share with others what it takes to learn web accessibility. She's been practicing web design development for 10 years, 6 of which she's been accomplice for accessibility. And Katerina Prun is a developer, designer, educator, speaker, and community organizer. She currently works as a senior instructor of computer science in the Messe College of Engineering and Computer Science at Portland State University, where she teaches classes on web development with a focus on accessibility, voice technologies, and cultural competence computing. Outside of work, she is a senior director for Women Who Code Portland, where she has spent the last 9 years building leadership team and the community in Portland. Really excited to welcome everyone here today. I think that everyone will be joining. There we go. We've got Jessica, we've got Amy. Great. Welcome, everybody. So I've given your kind of bios, but we're really interested in knowing a little bit more about yourself and your journey into accessibility. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about your journey so that everyone can understand how it is that you came to join us here today. So let's start with Jessica.
Hey everybody, I'm Jessica Rafuse. I cannot help but love everything that's happening in the chat, so keep it coming. All the way from Scotland, amazing. And I see some mamas out there with kiddos with disabilities. This is going to be really fun today. So Amanda, thank you so much for being our moderator. I've been in this gig for a while now. I have muscular dystrophy. I use a wheelchair. So this has been very personal for me. And but I gotta tell you a story how this all came about. I was an employment attorney, kind of doing my thing, and I had a job interview. And after 14 excruciating, I mean, we know how painful job interviews can be. 14 interviews, I finally get to my very last one. And the general counsel said to me, "So you're going to do our accessibility work, right?" And this was the first time I had heard that in all 14 interviews. And I thought, oh my gosh, did I just paint myself into a corner that I'm going to be that token person working on disability issues? But after 14 interviews, it just gave me the job. Let's see what we can do. And that was the first introduction I had to doing really focused work on disability and accessibility. And I fell madly in love with it. Turns out when you have a personal passion around things, you're really good at doing it professionally too. So that was my first introduction years and years ago. And again, I'm just super happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And absolutely, you're right. I think all of us here, we're all passionate about inclusion. And I think that accessibility is a perfect way for people to get more involved in being a proponent of that, right? Especially in tech. Amy, would you tell us a little bit more about your journey?
Hello. Mine started actually not too different from Jessica, except with my vision impairment that I've had all my life. A lot of times I can come off as a little more passing. It's a little less obvious to people unless you're really checking out my thick lenses here. But I was doing state work for the state of Alaska, and then it came up that we needed to be more accessible in my department and division on our websites, because I was doing their websites at the time for that. And I was like, yeah. Being the only web person for my division, I was considered the lead for getting all our stuff accessible. And we look at 2.0, and I've considered that was a part of web development that I really had an interest in. I hadn't really pursued accessibility too much, hadn't learned too much at that time, but of course, advocating for myself and other people like me was like, let's do this, let's figure it out. And as Jessica was saying, like I found out I had a passion for it, and driving it was not a big deal for me. It was like, this is great, and I know people personally that this is helping, aside from myself, but friends who are also visually impaired and people different motor disabilities, and so.
Amy, I'm so sorry to interrupt you in the middle of your really thoughtful answer. I wondered if we could just check your mic really quickly. It's kind of kind of a scary robot.
Let me just get my AirPods out. Sometimes they give me issues.
I think that we can fix this. Let's just check that before we keep going. Because I think we're all really interested in your answer. So I want to make sure. So much better.
Okay.
So I think
Can you hear me okay now? I'm a little less robot-like.
Let's take it from the top. We would love to hear your answer.
Okay. So I started out, I was doing state government work, and we were asked to make our websites accessible. I was the website person at the time. And I went ahead and just ran with it because that was a part of the whole front end package anyhow of development. And as somebody with a visual disability and visual impairment from birth, I was very happy to do that and have the support to do it. I know that support is one of the biggest problems. So once you have that support, you just run with it. And as I was mentioning that, like Jessica, I found that I had a passion for it, and it made it really easy to drive the project forward and making things accessible, getting the kind of training that we needed, training my coworkers alongside, and finding answers to those hard questions that can be really difficult. And so, yeah, I just ran with that, found out that there was certification through the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and said, this is perfect. This tells me where I'm have gaps at. And so, and I had the support to get the certification, which was really amazing. And then went from there. And that's how I had done my blog, The 100 Days of Accessibility, of just taking that journey forward, finding out what I needed to know, learning that, applying that, having the ability to apply it as I went, and then shooting off from there. Thank you, COVID, that it kind of pushed me forward to become, leave the state and work for myself and become that accessibility professional that I was felt driven to be. So here I am.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. Am I echoing also? I think okay. The idea of just like it's starting to explore, right, and kind of then you can see your gaps and where you need to fill in. And probably a lot of our audience is in the same position, right? They're not quite sure what they don't know, which so having access to some of this information here from all of you today will be really helpful. Katerina, would you tell us a little bit more about your journey?
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. My voice is like not doing super well today, but I'm hoping to be able to make it through the whole call. So my story is very similar to Amy's. I came to learn more about accessibility from doing front-end development. I started really from zero, and I started just learning a lot through various jobs. I knew it was really important because I also have some struggles with my vision. So I was really aware of that for myself, and that I do need like different aids to sometimes to be able to navigate, like especially on mobile. And so it was just really important to me to learn as much as possible and to bring it into the projects that I was working on. My journey has been sort of like one step at a time, and that a lot of it has been self-learn. And I think in the past few years, there's been so much more information available to everyone in regards to accessibility, which has been great. And I took a lot of what I've learned and I'm teaching it as part of my classes. So instead of kind of just, in a lot of cases, you get web development and front end education, but without any mention of accessibility, or with a very small mention here and there. But I think for me, like in terms of like the way I teach my classes, accessibility is there from the very beginning, and it's really at the core of anything that we're going to be building as part of the class.
Yeah, and I'll actually stay with you. And thank you for bearing with us with your voice. You sound perfect, by the way. So when this is a question for everyone, if you want to comment on it, but Katarina, why should people be thinking about accessibility when they're working on developing, right? Or I'd be curious, you said you always kind of start with that ethos when you start your classes, right? So how do you communicate, or what's your kind of rationale? Like, why do people need to be thinking about accessibility in development?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many reasons, but I think really the one I share this article. It's the curb cut effect, and it's a very famous one. It really talks about the curb cuts for sidewalks, and the fact that those didn't used to be there. And so in terms of like navigating a street in a wheelchair, it would be incredibly difficult to cross the street. And so now, having those curb cuts there makes it a lot easier in terms of, someone using a wheelchair, but also it makes it a lot easier for other people. So for example, parents with strollers. So I think the article obviously goes into a lot more detail, but I think one of the main things that I want my students to take away from this is that this actually creates a better experience. Like when we take that and when we apply it to web applications, it actually just creates a better experience for everyone accessing that specific application. And so it's not really just accessibility for like a small portion of the population. It's really there for everyone. And so and sometimes it is and a lot of times the reason for that is because it's a better user experience, and it just makes it easier to sort of just like navigate the application, whether you're using like keyboard only, whether you're using a screen reader. So all of those things I think are so important, and it just doesn't make sense to add it at the end of your development cycle, because by that point, you've already made so many mistakes along the way that you might just sort of like drop that implementation. And so when you start from the very beginning, when you actually create an accessible form, again, it's a better user experience for everyone. Just makes it easier to implement the whole thing, makes it really easy to test everything. So that's sort of the way that I go about teaching this. Like, let's learn how to build everything, all of our different components, to be accessible from the beginning.
I love that. And I specifically really love that article that you mentioned, the curb cut effect, or it's also just an effect, but because I like that article also counters this argument, right, that people make, like, well, should we really be putting this much money and effort in modification into spaces to just help something that affects just a few people? And what the studies show is like, actually, no, these modifications we make to help a few people who need it actually benefit everyone, is what you're saying, right? A lot of people use those curb cuts that who don't have disabilities, right? And so just this idea of like when we help underserved populations, everybody rises, right? Everybody wins, and I really like that. And Amy, I wonder if you had anything to add to that. And I know that your space is more of like a web space than like a mobile space. But are there any best practices and tools that people could be thinking about, or some accessibility best practices and tools that they can use to evaluate and improve accessibility in their designs?
Yeah, I think figuring out the standard of where you want to go, because there are guidance for accessibility. So you could start by looking at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I feel like that's a best practice or a very common ground for people to follow for accessibility. And as far as tooling, I feel like because of WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, there's a lot of tooling that's been built to try to target certain criteria within the guidelines. So you have color contrast, color pickers, that you can find the contrast between the text and the foreground, that low hanging fruit. Finding within the dev tools, there's an accessibility panel, at least I know of for sure, for Chrome and Firefox. You can start evaluating the code that you've used. Are you providing for components things that have a name and a role, and what that looks like? And then I've often used different bookmarklets within my browser that start targeting, again, more low-hanging fruit, like what do your heading levels look like? Do my images have alt text? And so it'll do that for you, where you can kind of just go on down the line, and you don't have to be, so knowledgeable with years of experience, but being able to grab that low hanging fruit to fix things, and then making that a part of your process, and maybe having some kind of checklist or baseline for your team to be able, are we doing these things? And again, just like Katarina said, like having that throughout the development process, what questions are designers asking themselves before it even hits the developers and before it even hits QA, that there are just different checkpoints along the way and different parts of the criteria of WCAG that can be targeted at that time and not fall on one person or one team.
Oh, that's great. And I think both of you are mentioning it needs to be there from the start. It needs to be there the whole way. And we would like to think that everybody would be on board with that sort of like culturally within the organization. And I'll give both of you a chance as well. But I wonder, Jessica, we're kind of talking about developing with accessibility in mind, but this is also sort of a culture question, right? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how can companies overall create a culture of accessibility, right, where all the team members are aware and committed to incorporating accessibilities into their work, and maybe whatever their work is, if it's development or some other aspect.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's hard to move off of that question. It's such a great one. I think all of the folks on this call hopefully understand the why. Yeah, it's important. It's the right thing to do, but you're going to come across a lot of professionals, very powerful people who might not yet understand the why. And so moving straight to the how, they might not be ready to do that just yet. I think for us, you build the strategy, and storytelling is a really important part of that. People need to make it real. They need to understand it. And one of our amazing storytellers that has taught me a whole lot is a woman named Swetha. And I will never forget sitting in the hack tent. So hackathons, I'm amongst friends who know what hackathon is, right? Lots of pizza, lots of solving big worldly problems. So Swetha and I were sitting in the hack tent, and she was telling me that when she communicates with her parents, she asks them to turn the lights off in the background. So Swetha is a deaf engineer, and she primarily uses lip reading to communicate. So lip reading can be really fatiguing, and Swetha is telling me that this is a lot of work to really focus in on her parents' mouths when she's talking to them. So we created a hack that was background blur. And I know that Amanda has some background blur going on. I know Katarina does. Amy has a background. So what does this tell us? Something that a deaf engineer created is now applied to so many people who are covering up the dirty laundry in the background, in my case, or children running around in all states of dress. but this is truly inclusive design. And when we tell those stories about the individuals, about the strengths that people with disabilities bring into the company, I think that helps folks understand why hiring people with disabilities is a very good business practice. And there are a few studies out there. So if you come across someone who says, yeah, but I want to see the data, and I think in technology, a lot of folks ask those questions. There's a couple really good studies that I think speak to the folks that are thinking about, why is this a business imperative? We know that disability inclusive companies report 28% higher revenue, 28%. So this is making money when we create an inclusive environment. 2 times higher net income, and they perform 30 times better on economic profit margins. So we know that this is a good business practice as well. And I think when you're developing this strategy, that's what you're thinking about. You're asking questions and you're listening to see what motivates certain folks, might not necessarily motivate others. But the great news is that accessibility speaks to all of those motivations, and we really can find a way to show folks that it is the right thing to do.
You said so many helpful and insightful things. But yeah, I think that everyone in their answers has gotten to the core of like kind of find how this will benefit, right? And it could benefit a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and then sort of make a plan and move toward that. And I do want to talk a little bit about how people can navigate sort of their careers and sort of entering as well. But I just wanted to give either Katarina or Amy or both a chance to also speak to this question about when you are working with your development teams, your engineers, your designers, and how do you have these conversations? What does that look like to make sure that everyone's on board before you get started in your project? So I wondered if either of you wanted to add to that as well.
I think just making sure that everybody's starting at the same points, being able to offer training to everyone so everyone can get on board. I mean, it all starts with awareness. Maybe you know someone personally with a disability, or maybe you don't, or maybe you don't know that that person has a disability, but just being able to get people on the same level of starting of awareness, and then working from there, and then trying to get that support like I had when I worked for the state. Of if you don't have that education from the top and that motivation from the top, a lot of times it's really hard to push as an individual to keep on going.
I think that's great, and I think that like town halls like this, and there's also so many certifications and things now, which will also unpack a little bit later, where people can get the education they need, right, to make sure that everybody can be doing these sort of things inclusively. I want to talk a little bit also now about sort of disabilities in the workplace, hiring and accommodations, and maybe some people would like some ideas about how they can be a good teammate or a hiring manager or people leader with sort of some of these things in mind. I wonder, Jessica, if you could speak with us a little bit about how do you think more specifically like a human resources or people management team can address some of the common challenges individuals with disabilities face during the hiring process, so maybe job postings or technical or behavioral interviews or onboarding, and if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. So number one, hire someone with a disability. Everybody out there, if you are a hiring manager, do it. I promise you, you will learn a ton and it will make your business better. Second is listening. And I know that sounds easy. We can all listen in various ways, whether that's email or it's in person. But it's actually a little bit harder than I think it sounds, because you have to provide the feedback systems, the tools for that feedback. And of course, those tools need to be accessible. So many times we see businesses that create listening systems and they're not accessible. So why did the blind employee or the deaf employee not provide that feedback? Why did the employee who has anxiety not provide feedback? Well, they probably weren't part of that process of creating those feedback tools. So bringing people with disabilities early on to address whether or not the systems are in place to receive that feedback. The second thing that needs to happen in order to do that really easy thing of listening is to create trust. Okay, this one's a little bit harder. There has to be a culture of trust where people feel comfortable coming forward and sharing what their feedback and what their experience is. Some ways to do that would be to model the way, show your best practices. Um, Amanda, am I allowed to give homework? Can I give to-do items?
I love homework personally. You can give it to me, and if anyone else.
Katarina's the teacher. She gave me permission to give homework. No, I think just some simple things that everybody can do to create this habit, this culture of accessibility, is that you can check the accessibility of your email before you send it. Pretty simple for you to do. Hit check accessibility every time you send it. You can even designate whether or not you prefer to receive accessible content, which I do. I prefer to receive an accessible email. I think another thing you can do is to make a really open space for people to ask for accommodations. So one thing that I do is I ask throughout the process, if anyone needs anything in order to fully participate, just let me know. And this is something you can say a lot and add to the beginning of a meeting, add it to the end of the meeting, and really talk about it. Make an open space so that you truly can listen. So yeah, I know it sounded simple, but it's complex.
No, those are great examples. And we had a couple of questions that I'll kind of put together here since you already started speaking about it. Katarina or Amy, I'd like to hear from both of you actually, but we'll start with Katarina. Jessica had mentioned the reading about the email accessibility, some of these like feedback tools that are accessible. Are there any other tools or initiatives or best practices that you're aware of or that you've seen that you think are especially effective for helping teammates and colleagues or other people with disabilities in a workspace?
I'll speak to some, but I'm sure that there are. I still consider myself to just be learning a lot about like accessible and inclusive workspaces. So feel free to add anything to what I have to say. I love what Jessica said about emails and figuring out how to make everything more accessible, because there's so many like tools available to you to make this to make everything you do, including emails, including slide decks, including web application, including mobile applications, more accessible. I think Amy also spoke about this a little bit earlier, the accessibility audits. So there are various extensions that you can add to your browser, which will just like run an accessibility audit on your code. And you know, that low-hanging fruit, but that low-hanging fruit is actually the majority of accessibility issues that we tend to see. And so it's so easy to fix, you know, the color contrast, the alt tags, the headings, making sure that your like input elements are properly labeled. And so, you know, just there are, without actually like needing to install anything, there are actually like accessibility audits that you can run, like Lighthouse in Chrome. You can take a look at the accessibility tree in Firefox. I think the Wave Aim extension is great. And then there are all these other extensions in terms of taking a look at your color. So there's, you know, there's color contrast, but then there's also a lot of colors that don't work super well for everyone. And so, for example, like red and green, if for some people, because of like the way they perceive colors, they won't end up perceiving the entire like light spectrum. And so those colors will be like really close to each other. And so there's various different extensions that you can use, like you put a website together and like are my colors going to be perceived well by everyone? And so that's also something that you can check. It's really straightforward. There's I don't know if some of you are familiar with Wordle, but the colors that they use are a lot of times the colors that get used for something correct versus incorrect is going to be red and green, which is great. Those work for obviously like most people, but at the same time, again, like when you're not able to like perceive color, those colors are both going to show up as sort of like a yellowish in some cases. And so the developer for that specific application actually took that into account and used specifically like yellow and green to account for that. And I like to also talk about this example in my classes because I think it's an important one, in that here you have a developer who is really aware of some accessibility issues and really did their best to sort of like address that. But at the same time, I think you might also be aware of this, but when you share your like Wordle on Twitter, you end up with all these emojis, and emojis are just like, these blocks of emojis are not actually particularly accessible for like navigating Twitter with like a screen reader. So again, it's great to be really cognizant of that from the very beginning, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to catch like every single issue, because again, it's such a learning process. You kind of like make mistakes and then you like learn from them, and hopefully you don't make them the next time. But going back to the question, again, we have all these different tools available to us. And so, accessibility audits, also like, checking color, and, checking whether our emails, checking whether our slides are accessible. These are all like important things to check. And they just they're going to give us the ability to also like learn a lot more about like what is actually like accessible versus what isn't, because for me, like, there were things that I just didn't know until I actually like got help from specific like extensions, like, oh, I actually need to be writing this differently. Great, now I know.
Thank you so much. And you've given us a lot of good ideas for things that I love that people can just start doing today, right? Like log off today and start doing some of this stuff, which is really great. Amy, I wanted to ask you if you have any also additional tools or anything that you'd like to mention. I would love to hear those. But this is also a question for everyone about creating a space, a workplace, or I guess a classroom, or it could be just your community, I guess, right? To help foster a safe space for individuals with disabilities, right? To feel like they can give that feedback, feel like they can disclose their disabilities, to get the support and accommodations that they need. Because some people, if we want to be allies, right? How do we create that space for the people with whom we work or teach or collaborate with? How do they feel safe in those spaces? And I'll start with Amy.
Yeah, I guess from my own personal perspective, because I've often not reported my disability, as I mentioned earlier, which might have been in my robot voice, that a lot of times I can come off as passing. I look like I can see just like everyone else and do things and operate the same way. So a lot of times I consider that irrelevant because I have my strategies and technologies that I can just use to meet me where I'm at. And so a lot of times if I wanted to report it feeling like that was relevant and not going to affect people's perception of me or their perception of how I can do my work, having a certain amount of anonymity, animosity, that I can do it privately, which HR should be allowing you that privacy as well, but having a way that I feel comfortable with HR talking about it, finding solutions with them for whatever accommodations I might need, and not having it it's blown up in the whole company if I don't feel like some people really need to know that information, but still having the accommodations that the law says that I can have. So that's the kind of space that I would need personally, that, being able to go and talk to that one person and having it just happen.
No, thank you for sharing. And so the idea of creating a space where you can pursue like your legal rights, right? That's that, and also safe, and safe as in you're defining safe as sort of private, anonymous, that it's not that you can get what you need without making it uh, disruptive for you personally. And I know that there's, right, the US federal government has a lot of laws. There's a disability rights guide from the ADA, right, on seeking employment, things like that. The Department of Labor has a lot of policies and things. But Jessica, I wonder if you could also speak to this question about how organizations, spaces can create that so it's safe, so that it's meeting legal standards or whatever, so that people feel comfortable to get the accommodations that they need.
Yeah. Sorry, Amy, go ahead.
I think that you could go ahead.
No, okay. All right, I'll go. I have to tell this story. I think you folks will appreciate it. So Katerina brought up color blindness and how people perceive colors differently. I was meeting with, let's say, Fortune 500, maybe even Fortune 100 company, very senior executive, who was curious about Microsoft culture. And so I shared with them a very easy trick. Windows key U pops up accessibility. Why? Because accessibility is about you. So try it, Windows key U. And I shared with him some of the color contrast features we have built into Windows. And after the meeting is all over, and I'm super excited about accessibility and doesn't mention anything. After the meeting's over, he comes up to me and he says, I am colorblind. I've never shared this with anyone, but I have the hardest time with red, yellow, green scorecards, because to him, it all looks the same. But how important is that? A scorecard that only represents information from color is information that this executive is not receiving. And it just struck me as a real cultural travesty that he didn't feel comfortable sharing that. I think the statistic is something like 1 in 12 Caucasian men has some form of color blindness. So if you're ever wondering why your partner has mismatched socks, maybe that's the reason. But kind of going back to this culture that can be created, I think that there are ways that we can do this programmatically. First is culture. Asking the question, is disability represented here? Whatever here might be. It could be in a meeting. It could be in an event. It could be in marketing. Whatever it is that your worldview is disability represented here? The systems, which we talked about in terms of feedback tools, but also how are your employees accessing their payroll information? Can an employee who is blind look at their pay stub and understand that information? If you don't know if those internal tools are accessible, they're not. Just assume that they are not. Don't go the other direction, but ask those questions. And this comes down to procurement. It comes down to the full-time employee who's responsible for that contract. Do they know how to ask whether or not the thing that they are buying is accessible, and how to confirm that? And then the third is I think more fun. Celebrate the story. Celebrate your SWEPA. I know that every organization has an example of someone with a disability who's doing really amazing things. Amplify that person's voice. Bring them to the table. Make sure that they are being recognized for the amazing talent that they bring. And I think that is what creates a safe place where others, like this executive who didn't feel comfortable in his space, would have seen allies and would have been able to share that story and get the resources he needed.
Yeah, I think those are really helpful. I have a follow-up, because in some of the introductory comments, Amy, was it you were talking about, or maybe it was Katerina, I apologize, a lot of information, but the idea of becoming the token person, right, in the space as well. So I love this advice about celebrating people who represent these demographics in our spaces, but how can we do that in a safe way so the person also doesn't feel tokenized, right? That they aren't the representative for disability in their organization. And I wondered, because I don't think that's what you were talking about doing, but it's a question I personally have. I wondered if you could speak to that, Jessica, or if either Katerina or Amy also wants to speak to that.
I think that one's really important when it comes to non-apparent disabilities or invisible disabilities as well. Disclosure is a very personal experience. So as a wheelchair user, I was used to my entire career rolling into a room and not needing to disclose. People knew, people saw. And then when the pandemic happened, I suddenly became someone who had a non-apparent disability for the first time. And my own identity was something I really needed to address. When did I want to disclose? I got to choose. And it was almost like taking back the power where I had the decision making on whether or not and how I shared my disability. And it was a really interesting kind of exploration of my own identity. Where I landed is that I would never, ever tell someone they needed to disclose because it is so personal. What I can do is share the ways in which disclosure has enriched my life. And they can make the decision based on that. But I am in a career that I love, a job that I love. I have best friends because I've shared more about my disability. And I think that vulnerability has been really important for my own identity. But it's ultimately up to the individual to make the decision about whether or not that is a moment that they want to disclose or not.
That's perfect. It's all about like respect and communication, right?
That's good.
Katerina or Amy, did you want to speak to this at all about how can we celebrate individuals, recognize individuals, but also maybe not tokenize individuals, like just keeping things safe?
The only thing I wanted to add is on that if someone is choosing not to disclose to everyone, maybe there are specific people, just HR, or maybe a close colleague, and just honoring that decision that you respect that they don't want to talk about it or make it a big deal, or maybe they're worried about, like, I don't want to be a token person. I don't want to look like I achieved this because for this reason or whatever, or even to say that I'm the person who represents all the visually impaired community, because it's not true. I feel like mine is always a weird off case anyhow from what we think of as blind or low vision people, because my needs and how I need to access technology and websites is just different. And so I think we can support people by just honoring what they've chosen for themselves. And if they change their mind, honoring that decision, that if I want to bring it out to people and talk about it and take that approach and share my perspective, then honor that as well.
Oh, thank you for that. And I like this common theme of it doesn't really matter if you necessarily know or not if there's someone who needs accommodations on your team. It's just, these are just good practices, right? To incorporate into your slide decks, into your emails, into your, just like create an accessible space. And as Katerina pointed out with the study about the curb cut, everyone will benefit. They might end up using that change or modification in a way we didn't anticipate, right? Like the blurred background, but still it will benefit other people as well. I do want to talk a little bit more about how to more specifically be an advocate or for accessibility in spaces. And we've gestured toward this, but since we're wrapping up here in about 10 minutes, I just want to make sure that people leave feeling confident that they can go into their spaces and act as an ally and advocate. Before we do that, and the answer might be no, Jessica, but are there any recent sort of legal developments or changes in disability rights that have significantly impacted the tech industry, or maybe even just workspaces that people should know about?
Yeah, so thanks for coming back to that. I forgot that you had asked that question about the laws. Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think it's really interesting to read up on this movement from disability rights to disability justice. Very, very powerful concepts like intersectionality, which we haven't had to talk about yet here, but I think it's a really important one to come back to, is the intersectionality of disability and other minority groups. So really cool stuff there. So explore that. I know we're running out of time. But in terms of the accessibility, I would say laws, legislation that are kind of top of mind for me. One is related to product, and this is the European Accessibility Act. I think we've got some friends here that are from European Union member states. If you are, you're probably very well aware of the European Accessibility Act. For those who aren't, do some digging around this one. Ask your legal departments or do some quick searches to learn more about the European Accessibility Act. This is one that I think is going to really set the bar, raise the bar a bit higher for multinational companies, first of all, but then moving into other jurisdictions where it's really changing this landscape of accessibility and what it means to be a disabled person in these spaces. The second one that I'll bring up is around reporting. So we're learning a lot from sustainability as a movement, as a area of importance, especially in the European Union again. And so check out CSRD, the corporate sustainability reporting directive. Lots of acronyms that we do in the tech industry, but CSRD is an important one because they have also brought disability underneath these reporting requirements. So you're going to start seeing business, including the tech industries, starting to report on things like the number of board of director members with disabilities. They're going to start reporting on the number of employees with disabilities. You're going to see them reporting on policies that they have internally. This one, again, I think is going to extend beyond the European Union. The third one that is really top of mind for me right now is related to people. How many folks out there, you don't need to raise your hand or type in the chat if you don't like to, know that it's legal to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage in the United States? Like, in a word, gross. Certainly does not align with my mission and values, but it is something that is changing. There are now two paths to eradicating subminimum wage at a federal level. Definitely keep your eye on these. Questions to ask your organizations would be, do we currently pay any employees less than minimum wage? Do we partner with suppliers who pay their employees less than minimum wage? If so, how can we make policy changes to our procurement practices that will in fact eradicate subminimum wage for us? And then what are we doing to hire folks with disabilities into our company? So product, reporting, people, those are the three things I'd say keep an eye on.
Wow, that's shocking. It's interesting. The more you learn, right, the more empowered you feel, but also like angry. Do you know, like,
Yes.
like find
Part of it, Amanda.
that's why we're all here, right? We need to do better. Everyone needs to do better, and then we can start, right, with having conversations like this. I wondered, Amy, again, we've all kind of gestured toward this, but just some key takeaways for people leaving today. What's something they can do? What advice do you have for individuals who want to actively promote accessibility and inclusion within their tech teams or companies? How do they get those conversations started?
Yeah. Well, the first thing, I have 6 things that I think would be good. First off is supporting yourself. Finding a network for accessibility supports right away. Accessibility work can be a lonely job, and finding people that you could connect with to keep pushing you forward, whether it's within your work or outside of your work, because there's a lot of accessibility networking out there. So find people that you vibe with and help you keep moving forward and learning. And then start with you. Make your work accessible. They can't, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. Your work can't stop you from doing that. So just doing all the little things, like Jessica was saying, even if it's checking your emails for accessibility, but just starting with you. Keep learning. Become an advocate or an expert for others in your organization, that they can come to you and feel that you are open to those discussions about accessibility, becoming that champion for your team or company. Request that your team or company receive professional training for accessibility, because as I mentioned before, getting everybody at the same baseline, bringing in that awareness so everybody can have conversations, they can ask questions during each phase of service and product. Being a part of policies or guidance, if you just don't have a lot of power within, even just making documentation to help everyone follow the same accessibility rules and guidance so your team can work together on some of the same things and you're not the only one holding that knowledge. And then last of all, I recommend don't lose heart. It can be a thankless or an uphill battle a lot of times that you'll find. But you're doing the right thing by giving access to people with disabilities. And it's great that you want to be a part of that and be an advocate. So keep going.
No, I think this is just a great little like toolkit, right, to put in your pocket and take out just to get started today. And Katerina, I wondered if you had anything to add to that, and specifically around, like, you're an educator, right? So that how can we continue to educate our communities and change makers so that, you know, we have a positive change, right, in organizations and communities around accessibility?
Yeah, I think well, first of all, I just want to like start by upvoting everything that Jessica and Amy have said, because I think they've just made so many great points up until now. I just want to share a couple of things. One, I think the earlier that we start teaching people about accessibility, the better. Obviously that's possible with new students, and I hope as much as possible that there is going to be more accessibility teaching at high school and college level. I hope there is going to be specific funding from companies to be able to build those modules, to build those courses that can then be used by educators at high school and college levels. Beyond that, I think one of the things that I did, and Amy also mentioned this, so I'm just going to reiterate that because sometimes it's just really important to reiterate points. I think the more that you document any sort of process, the easier it is for someone else to follow it. The easier it is for someone who comes into your team is to know, like, these are all the accessibility guidelines we're going to follow for building our product. If that's actually documented, it's easier to learn that. If you document how to run every single test that you're going to do in regards to accessibility, again, it's a lower barrier to entry for a new developer, someone who's joining your team, to start doing it, and also lower barrier for someone who's already on your team as well. So I think a big part, I know when I was a front-end developer, everything I learned, I just kind of documented, this is what I'm learning, this is what I think we should do. Let me just share this information with everyone else. And eventually, you start with a small doc, but eventually you kind of keep adding to it, and your applications just get better and better. And I think, from an education standpoint, it's the same thing. When I started teaching accessibility, I would sort of go over everything and then talk about and then we can run all of these tests. And then in the homework assignments, it would be you are expected to run this test. And half the people wouldn't run the tests. And half the people wouldn't turn the stuff from the slide. So I think what I've learned to do is just to just put more videos out there in terms of this is exactly how you run this. You see this error, this is how you're gonna fix it. Because again, the more education and the more process you put out there, the barrier to entry just gets lower. It gets easier for everyone to do that, and hopefully we get this message out to more people. And like you said, man, the more you learn, the angrier you get. But anger is also good because it also helps you develop a passion and a drive to do something. And so and accessibility is definitely an area that needs as many allies as possible.
No, I love that. And I think just this whole panel discussion about just get curious, take inventory, see what, your practices you're currently following, what you're doing right, get the knowledge that you need, share that knowledge and do the work, right? Which is something that we can all start doing immediately today, and also help advocate for other people to do as well. We're really at the top of the hour here. I really wanted to thank the three of you for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us. In addition to all of these really helpful tools and insights that you've given us, we've also put together a small, you can learn more about accessibility and Women Who Code. We have a lot of on-demand content as well, in addition to sessions like this. And also, we've put together a toolkit that has some resources that people can do some more reading on as well. We also wanted to share with everyone the opportunity to know that Giving Tuesday is coming up. And if you like programs like this that we are helping to educate our community on, please save the date. If you are interested in giving to an organization, Women Who Code is a nonprofit, and as your gifts allow us to continue to share messages like this and to put on programs like this so that we can continue to educate people about a more equitable tech industry. And thank you so much. And we can't thank you enough for your time. And if any final closing thoughts that you wanted to share with us before we log off today?
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really been our pleasure.
Thank you for putting this event together. It's a great opportunity to talk about this and learn more.
Wonderful. Okay, and everyone, if you're interested in learning more about our speakers, you can find them on LinkedIn. And Katarina's also has her GitHub as well. You can connect with her in her repository. And we're looking forward to seeing you at future Women in Code advocacy town halls. Thank you, everyone. Have a super day.